How would you define what a woman is?
So, Daily Wire, you've got some explaining to do because Matt Walsh is not the first one to put out something called What is a Woman? And today I have a very special guest, Joesph Backholm, who produced what I believe is the original What is a Woman? Thanks for coming onto the channel, Joesph.
Hey, good to be with you, Mike. Thanks so much.
I actually got a call. I want to say this would have been 2019, right? Something like that.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And the Women's March, it doesn't get as much headlines now as it used to, but it was.
I don't even know, actually, does it even happen? Is there still a Women's March? I think now that we've gotten rid of Donald Trump, I think there's no need for a Women's March.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's only when Trump was president, basically. But they had the big one, made the headlines. And then they had another one the following year. This is the one that you went to. And I actually got the call to go film this. I'll play a clip of it real quick just so people can get a taste of it here.
What would you say is the biggest obstacle to equality between men and women today?
I'm always treated differently.
I think the biggest challenge is the mindset of a lot of white men in particular in this country.
I mean, the administration, hands down.
I think there is such a thing as entitlement.
Pads, you can think of a plethora of reasons.
And I see it quite often when the men jump in front of me to lift things or to back a truck onto a trailer or anything like that.
There's just a big struggle for respect
in employment and assignments that were given and pay that was given.
I think there's no equal pay at all.
Women have to work so much harder to get to the point that men can easily get to.
How would you define what a woman is?
How do I define what a woman is?
Oh my God.
I think a woman, that's a trick question.
Oh, wow.
I think a woman is anything that she wants to be defined as.
Well, that's a good question. Let me think about that.
A human being.
She's an individual.
A woman is powerful. A woman is really the creator of our society. Without women, we won't even be able to reproduce the planet.
It was just one of those marches, rallies, demonstrations that we see often on the left, where it's kind of this amalgamation of issues. And, it's kind of like, women's rights, racial equality, free mumia. There's all of, whatever your cause is, you kind of come and you demonstrate because it's just this activism. Of course, at the height of maybe that's the height of the fervor against Donald Trump. It was pretty intense the entire time. And I suppose that remains. But the Women's March was the theme, and down with misogyny, down with the hegemony, and down with the patriarchy, all of those kind of things.
What would you say with some of your biggest takeaways? I know we shot a number of videos and I'll put those all in the description. They're all worth a watch. But what would you think were some of your biggest takeaways from filming there at the Women's March?
It's always interesting to me to see how little work people do generally to create consistency and coherence in their worldview. And, the headline there, and the reason that we're talking about this, and later, of course, Matt Walsh did a really good job of blowing up this topic, is in the height of the Women's March, we are also seeing this insistence that being female is not a biological thing. And so, of course, the punchline of the video in our time there is, can the women at the Women's March define what a woman is? Which seems to be a pretty basic idea. And you would assume that somebody who's going to go advocate for women would at least be able to tell you what a woman is. But, spoiler alert, they could not do so, right? And that's why it was funny. But it's also really instructive to just understand the way the culture thinks or does not think. Largely we emote, largely we feel. And so we don't do even the basic work of thinking, well, I'm a women's rights activist. Women, as compared to men, have special concerns and special needs and special issues, and I want to advocate for them so they do not end up being marginalized and oppressed and taken advantage of. That means necessarily there is this category of woman, but they can't tell you what that is, because really what they've embraced is this idea that my identity is determined by my feelings, that it is, I'm a self-created being. That's kind of really the underlying, I should say, assumption of modern progressive thought. And if you are a self-created being, therefore the categories of male and female don't exist. Therefore, that makes it very difficult for the other kind of identity categories that they want to play critical theory, intersectional oppression Olympics with. And so that to me was, I don't know that it was a brand new discovery. I frankly got the answers that I expected, but it was another illustration of the fact that we are not good at thinking.
I very much agree with that. And one of the things you talked about, or consistency of thought, or inconsistency in worldview, but there's this consistency of problems that, and you anticipating these answers. And you actually see that too in the way that you structure the questions prior to the interview. And that's one of the things that I love so much about these videos is there's different kinds of sort of man on the street type interviews. And some of them, there's people who just clown on whoever, they're talking against or whatever. What I love about these videos is you're so winsome about it. They don't have a clue that you have a completely opposite worldview as them. In fact, many of them, I imagine, assumed they thought that you were on the same side as them. But the way you structure the questions, you can show the way their thought process is inconsistent, and they do it so consistently that you brought that out really well. Do you think the answers that you received in that Women's March are different than maybe if there was a new Women's March and you were to get answers for those questions today? Do you think those answers are consistent from back then, or do you think there's been some changes since then?
I don't think there have been dramatic changes specifically on the life issue. We've been debating abortion for a very long time, and increasingly, and I've actually written some things on this in the last couple of years about the abortion issue and whether it is a necessary evil or a moral good. And the reality is, most Americans, including pro-choice Americans, don't believe abortion is a good thing. They think abortion is essentially the break glass in case of emergency contingency plan that is necessary. And this risks derailing this conversation entirely, but it's a point I think worth making, is that I think the reason people believe abortion is necessary is because we believe sex is necessary to make us happy. That's what Dr. Freud told us, and that's what all of our sex ed classes and all of our movies tell us, right? The climax, no pun intended, of all of the movies that we see in Hollywood is having sex with somebody that you're attracted to. And so the message is given implicitly and explicitly that if you're not having sex, if you're not doing whatever you want with your genitals, you can't be happy. And we all understand biologically that pregnancy is a necessary result of sexual activity. And so we have decided collectively as a culture, thanks to the sexual revolution, that you cannot be happy without sex. And therefore, abortion is necessary to make sure that you can deal with pregnancy when it happens, because it is unthinkable to suggest that we would not have sex until we are prepared to be parents. It is more unthinkable than it would be that we will kill the children that result. The commonality, the common ground that we have with abortion advocates is that we actually all want the same thing for people. We want people to be happy, to have joy, to have love, to have belonging, to have commitment and community and all of those things. The difference is between the gospel and the sexual revolution is, what is that path to happiness? Freud and the sexual revolution tell you the path to happiness is unlimited, unrestrained sex, as long as everybody consents. That's how you're happy. Of course, the gospel has a very different understanding that in his presence is fullness of joy. At his right hand are pleasures evermore. That's the end of Psalm 16. Just very different paths to that destination. And of course, there's now significant evidence that the sexual revolutionary path to happiness doesn't quite deliver on its promise.
And requires a lot of cocaine, as Freud very much pointed out.
That's right.
So you have these street interviews. They did really well on YouTube, and they were done on a channel called What Would You Say? Do you mind sharing a little bit about your involvement in that and some of your favorite projects that you got to do on that channel.
Yeah, what would you say is something that I'm really proud of, and I love that project. It was made for the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and it is 3 to 5 minute animated videos answering common questions about faith and culture, and still producing content. I did the early content. It's been a couple of years since I was involved in that now, but visual talking points is what we were trying to create there, and a lot of questions that people frequently have, and we hope that we provided and are continuing to provide really great, helpful, succinct answers to common questions.
Absolutely. I loved a lot of the stuff, especially the content you put out. It's kind of like, if anybody's ever seen PragerU stuff, it's like the Christian alternative to PragerU, which we definitely need those alternatives to a lot of conservative media, whether that's the Daily Wire, it's a big one right now, PragerU. Having Christians stand up and talk about these things is super helpful. What do you think is of the videos that you were involved in were some of your favorites in either writing the scripts or just the final product?
Well, that's a good question. I hadn't thought about that for a while. You know, the ones that we did on critical theory, we're kind of on the cutting edge of that conversation, where critical theory kind of, that term, the concept has been around for a long time, but the term critical theory kind of penetrated the public consciousness kind of 2018, 2019. And so we did a couple videos there on, is critical theory biblical? Is critical theory practical? Where we were really kind of on the front edge of helping people understand what it is that we're dealing with, and also comparing and contrasting it to a biblical worldview. And so those ones, they did well, but they also, I know, continue to inform and educate people about something that we're still really confused about, even though, you know, every day we see more examples of kind of the critical theory malaise that we're all living in.
You're in a conversation and someone says, since God cares about the oppressed, Christians should embrace critical theory because it's trying to eliminate oppression too. What would you say? Critical theory is one way our culture attempts to explain and confront power structures. Some Christians have embraced it as well. But what is it? To understand critical theory, we need to understand its two primary claims. First, everyone can be divided into two groups, those who have power and those who don't. Second, those who have power always oppress those who don't. But how do we know who the oppressed and who the oppressors are?
So, I don't know if a lot of you guys realize this, but Joesph is actually an internet star. He has gone viral in one of my favorite videos. This one's from a while ago. We both originate from Washington State. That's where we grew up. And he does this video at the University of Washington, which is where I went to school. And he becomes a 6'5" Chinese woman.
So if I told you that I was a woman, what would your response be?
Good for you. Okay, like, yeah.
Nice to meet you.
I'll be like, what?
If I told you I'm 6 feet 5 inches, what would you say?
That I would question.
Why?
Because you're not. No, I don't think you're 6'5". If you truly believed you're 6'5", I don't think it's harmful. I think it's fine if you believe that. It doesn't matter.
This was a different time. It feels weird to say that, but this was much earlier in a lot of the gender questions. How did a lot of Christians respond to it?
Yeah, and it was a totally different time. You know, this is now 2016. And so as I say that, we're sitting here in 2024, right? It's like 8 years ago almost now. But Washington State was one of the very first places to create rules that specifically clarified that, it's a bad word to use for this, but said that gender identity is your gender. So men can become women by declaring it, women can become men by declaring it, therefore men can have access to all of these facilities. And so they did this through the rulemaking process in Washington State. The legislature was not involved in that. And I was running a public policy organization in Washington State dealing with these issues at the time. And really, we were just sitting in the office thinking, they can't really believe what they are saying. Can they? Do they really believe that a man can become a woman by declaring himself to be female? This is insane. We're like, well, let's go ask people, do they actually believe that? So we went to the University of Washington the next morning and just ran a microphone around and just started asking these questions, can I identify as a woman if I want to? And of course, the answer to that is yes. Can I identify as Chinese? Can I identify as 6'5"? Can I identify as 7 years old? All of these things to just kind of test the limits of the logic of self-identification. And I was actually surprised at how consistently the students at the University of Washington at that time, of course, I'm also an alum of the University of Washington, that they just, yeah, you can be whatever you want to be. I will celebrate whatever you want to be, as long as that, going back to Freud, is the thing that makes you happy. And so I was alarmed at that time. In the 8 years since then, we've realized this is actually the ethos and the worldview of the left, that your feelings are king, and you can be whatever you want to be, and they have insisted that that is reality. I started that job in 2008, which, we're just talking about 2016 being a lifetime ago, which it feels like. 2008. In 2008, same-sex marriage wasn't a thing anywhere. It was, well, that's not Hawaii. I think their Supreme Court had done something at that point. But debates about domestic partnerships were really what were raging at that time. And there was a lot of, hesitancy from the church to jump in. We understand all of the slander that is thrown around if somebody has the audacity to say what is increasingly a minority position in America now, that, oh, marriage is a relationship between a man and a woman. And we've seen public opinion on that completely reversed in the last 30, 40 years, where it was a 70-30 pro-marriage position. Now it's a 70-30 pro do whatever you want position. And that's kind of how public opinion has moved. And because the culture is shifting, the church is trying to figure out how to deal with that. Do I want to say things that I know God agrees with, even if it's going to provide a backlash? And so one of the challenges that we continue to navigate in the American church context is, do we run away from conflict? When should we say things? And I'm not somebody who thinks you should always, we don't need to pick fights with people, especially on a one-on-one basis. But the question really has become, are we as a church willing to say the things that we know God thinks, even if there's going to be consequences for that? And I've seen a lot of churches say, no, I'm not going to say that. There's a long list of churches now that have basically kind of abandoned the gospel, and because the cultural heat was too much and we just really wanted to be liked. And so we came up with a new, modern, innovative interpretation of all the things that God said, and decided that every Christian for the last 2 millennia has been wrong, until we discovered this new revelation, which we're all basically our own Joseph Smiths now, where we've got special insight into God's truth that nobody before us ever had, and they were all wrong, and suddenly we're right, and we're much smarter and modern. It just so happens to be convenient that it's also politically acceptable. So that's kind of the world that we're living in now. And so churches continue to navigate this.
So we have these churches that you mentioned that didn't want to speak out, and certainly some of those are kind of straying into an unorthodox position, as you mentioned, especially on marriage. What were some of the reasons, like specific reasons, do you think that a lot of pastors, other than just pushback from their congregation, what do you think are some other reasons that pastors were afraid to speak up?
Yeah, well, there's definitely a fear of conflict, which kind of addressed there, and a fear of being misunderstood. In some cases, there's also a fear of losing their tax-exempt status. There's a coordinated campaign within secular organizations to try to convince churches that if you even whisper something about abortion or same-sex marriage or an election, that you're going to lose your tax-exempt status. It's all false. But for obvious reasons, there's an incentive for secularists to try to encourage the church to withdraw their influence, to be mute, to not say the things that they know that are true, to not encourage each other to engage. Because if we create a vacuum in the public space, they are eager to fill it. But there's also, this concern, there's this sensibility among some in the church that it's wrong to legislate my morality, that that I don't want to force people to do what I would prefer that we do. Now, in one sense, it's true that you can't legislate morality. You can't legislate morality in the sense that you can't use the law to make people do good things, to be good, to have good hearts. So in that sense, you can't legislate morality. But in reality, the only thing we ever do is legislate morality. All law is fundamentally taking a position about what is good, what is bad, what is desirable, what is not desirable, what's helpful, what's unhelpful, right? Every law, environmental regulations, tax codes, criminal laws, of course, are all saying this is good, this is not good, this is desirable, this is undesirable. So the reality is the only thing we can do is legislate morality. The real question is whose morality is going to be legislated. That is a conversation the church should be eager to be involved in. But because we're nice, gentle people, we don't want conflict. We don't want to feel like other people, we don't want others to feel like we're trying to manipulate them and force them to be like us through force of the gun from the government. We are easily manipulated by slogans like that. And so the reasons why churches are hesitant, it's not a simple answer to that question, but there are many answers to that questions, and all of them lead to the same place, which is I withdraw my influence, therefore you get to do what you want to do, and I'll sit back and be pious and feel better about myself, even though I'm going to allow terrible things to happen that I know are going to ruin other people's lives. So that's a problem, which is why we need courage.
Absolutely. So speaking to that courage, we both come from the state of Washington. Neither of us live there, and not for lack of courage, but I feel like living in that area, especially when a lot of these things were going down, I imagine that and this is something that we've talked about before, just the isolation and even just like loneliness, feeling like there's not a lot of Christians doing stuff. What would you say to a believer? Let's say they're living in Washington or California or wherever you are when you're watching this video, and maybe you feel that way. What would you say to that person as somebody who has pushed through and has continued to do things to glorify God, to further expand the kingdom of God? What would you say to that person?
Well, I think all of us just need to do what God wants us to do. And, he did use Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Babylon very effectively. I think God wants the church in Babylon, whatever that Babylonian context for you and I is. So I am not an advocate of let's just all leave all of these places where secularism is kind of, to borrow their term, the hegemonic power within that culture. But I also think there are situations, depending on your family's context, where it might be better for your family. And maybe he is calling you to someplace else. And as school choice becomes a movement that will exist in half the states and not in half the states, if the choice is I can give my kid a secular education here, or I can give my kid a Christian discipleship education someplace else, you have to choose that. And that requires relocation. You do that. You can't let drag queens disciple your kids between kindergarten and 12th grade. So if that's the situation, if that's the choice, then yeah, you have to be prepared to maybe make some serious choices. So I can't tell one person what God's will for their life is, but what I do think we need to be willing to do is, hold open-handedly, what our goals for ourselves is. I didn't say that correctly. I didn't say that well from a grammatical perspective.
Actually, I'd like to highlight that Joesph is an attorney and has spent the vast majority of his life not doing really attorney. I mean, there's some law, I guess, related in what you do, but this should be a very easy question. Would you make more money as an attorney or more money in ministry where you're at now?
Well, yeah, that's an easy one. Yes, though I would have had the golden handcuffs, and I would have. I mean, I've worked in law firms, and I did that early in my life, and it became pretty clear to me that that's not what I was created for, and I just didn't love the work, and that was part of my discovery of God's plan for my life. So yeah, there are better ways to make money than to talk about worldview and culture war issues. But there's a lot of comfort and satisfaction in just doing what God made you to do.
What are you up to these days, and where can people find you on social media and watch some of the stuff that you're putting
Yeah,
out?
well, I kind of have this fun space where I do a lot of different things. I am significantly, the title I carry around most is Senior Fellow for Biblical Worldview at the Family Research Council. And I have worked there. I also host a podcast for them called Outstanding, which I would encourage everybody to check out. You can get it on all of the platforms where podcasts can be found, and do that every Tuesday and Friday. We release new episodes. I am increasingly active at my own website, joesph.backholm.com, where I'm doing worldview stuff, and there are curriculum that's going to be available there. And I do some of my own kind of instruction and all of my writing for things like World Opinions. I write for them, and also the Washington Stand, which is a online news outlet of Family Research Council. So I'm writing various places there. And you can also find me on Twitter/X now at Joesph Backholm as well. And I have conversations there also.
Awesome. Yeah. And I know for viewers on my channel, most of them are going to be familiar with Calvin Robinson. You interviewed him fairly recently, from what I understand. I'll put a link to that specific one as well, because I know a lot of my viewers will be interested in that, as well as links to the other things that he mentioned here. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Joesph, and look forward to having you again on sometime and seeing you in the near future.
It's great to be with you, Mike. Thanks so much.